Okay, thanks everybody. I'm presenting on behalf of the Design Research Laboratory. I just want to introduce myself. My name's Theodore Spyropoulos. I'm the director of the course. We have a very large staff and consultants, so if you excuse me, you're going to get a chance to meet them very soon. What I thought actually in terms of today, which is one of the few occasions that we have that we come together as a graduate school, is to welcome you, obviously, as almost all faculty members are doing, but also to encourage you as a kind of reminder to really get to know each other and actually foster a little bit of a community. This is a time of year for me which is always a moment of self-reflection. On the one hand, we have incoming students with an amazing enthusiasm and motivation. On the other hand, we have thesis students which are problematized with a burden called architecture. And in a way, this kind of overlap is very apparent in the studio as I visit our Phase 2 students really struggling to deal with the complexities of some of the things that they've actually put on the table for themselves. And on the other hand, students who are very encouraged to come and see what's going on in the library, reading, trying to sort of get themselves acclimated to a new context, a new school. But I guess my encouragement in terms of the conversation I'd like to have with you guys today is just to suggest the sort of architectural tourism that brought you here is kind of over. And now you've basically entered within the community of the AA. And part of that, I think, is really a certain sense of accountability and an openness to ideas, a belief system that architecture matters, that research, design actually has a place in this world when many people are going to tell you otherwise. I set up the conversation really about talking about something like a continuing experiment. This was a publication at the AA by James Gowan, and it's a continuing experiment as much for staff as it is for students. We foster a very collaborative kind of practice-based environment. Within the course itself, we have a certain attitude towards the collective within the course, within the people that we work with, within the community of the AA, and the community outside who basically come through the doors to actually engage with our students, the work that we're doing, and the kinds of things that we're interested in doing. Design Research Lab is first and foremost a place where we try to privilege experimentation and research. We do that by basically organizing the studio over speculative design agendas that run 3 to 4 years. There's speculative problems that we try to address that deal with issues of scale, materiality, the role of computation, and try in a certain way to find ways to think about things in a systemic way and in a much more contemporary way, sort of understanding that there's a deep-rooted history of a lot of these subjects, but also understanding that there is an architecture of the now that you are participating in, and those terms of reference are things that we actually have to revisit. Within the school, I mean, things like John Fraser and Cedric Price and people like Gordon Pask are obviously part of the legacy of where computation resides. Our attitude is about sort of evolving some of those kind of discourses within something that we call the generative. We believe in generative practices. They privilege a certain attitude that's time-based. They privilege a certain relationship to materials, to organizational systems, and we try to, in every way that we can, try to understand a better way of understanding. What we're proposing in a certain way within the student thesis projects is alternative models. We're not suggesting this is the right way, this isn't some kind of religious cult to talk about the role of the digital. What we're trying to talk about is a continuing experiment, looking at experimental practice and trying to situate that with the tools, the techniques, the methodologies, and an evolving history which I think is becoming very apparent to us as we look for friends, and one could even say enemies, within the discourses that shape a lot of the things that we do. But time-based ways of understanding are things that are becoming very afforded to us. A certain kind of open platform and open source relationship to the tools is basically fostering a new community that goes beyond, let's say, the conventions of what we call school. Within the DRL, I believe that we foster certain kinds of things. One of them is to understand a certain model of interaction. One of them about exploring what intelligence actually means within design culture, and the other one is a sense of experience. For as much as people may look at the work We have a certain conviction of actually working towards human-centric attitudes towards things. That does not mean that we don't deal with robotics, machines, and a whole series of other discourses, but it does mean that we are very open to really what the possibilities of technology and other research institutions are developing, where we can actually start to understand what it means to participate, and when machines themselves really don't need us anymore. To think about today, I think, is also to think a little bit about the history or an evolving project. We like to situate our discourses relative to our own discourse. But actually, if you look at something like in 1913, this is the cover of Scientific America, you can understand that what they thought about in terms of the city was much more open, where infrastructure, ideas of mobility were really challenging a very three-dimensional idea of the urban. A lot of the things that we're looking at within the studio today are revisiting certain notions of urban prototyping. We have a lot of, let's say, friends that we sort of explore through the ages, from metabolisms, experiments that are actually talking about different ideas of deployability, a creative rethink of certain projects that have become quite seminal without necessarily always articulating the implication of what this is, like Broadacre City, and Frank Lloyd Wright actually designing these flying helicopter-like vessels that would enable a new sort of activation within the city itself. The challenges, I think, within the studio, every 3 years, every 4 years, shift in scale. At the largest scale, we were revisiting certain things that we were calling parametric urbanism. For example, something like Kenzo Tange's project of about 8 million inhabitants that would be designed within a particular city. When we deal with the idea of complexity, it's not necessarily in terms of how complex things look, but a deeper understanding really about what it means to design within this much larger time-based, scenario-based versioning of things. So as I mentioned before, the DRL really does have a very strong attitude towards design, which is coming from a certain attitude towards the collective. We work as small groups of 3 or 4 students together collectively on projects that run for a year's time. We, like every other course, is structured in terms, but we basically foster a certain attitude towards education through that. The history of participation and teamwork is obviously something that's not new in the practice of architecture, but for sure it's new with respect to how we consider the education of the architect. But if you look at seminal projects, things that are happening in this room, people like Cedric Price and Gordon Pask and John Fraser are very much contributing to a new project, a speculative project, a project that basically is set forth as a research project, as a way of actually understanding things. This isn't new even in terms of disciplinary distinction. Something like experiments for art and technology would foster a certain relationship between artists and engineers. Engineers from Bell Labs that were developing the most innovative, technologically driven technologies, and people like Robert Rauschenberg and Bob Whitman, who were really at the forefront of art practice in New York. Collaborations don't necessarily mean only between people. We're going to spend a lot of time actually dealing with the consequences of thinking about new forms of production, and new forms of production that move beyond the sort of mechanical or the machinic, talking about issues of robotics and other CNC technologies, talking about the problems of materiality and phase change. Within the history of a sort of laboratory environment, I'd like to use the example of the architecture machine group that was fostered in the mid-60s as an experiment, a 10-year experiment. Experiments like this that were very telling, or maybe one of the more seminal projects, is basically an environment for gerbils. The gerbils became a very important part of sort of demystifying a kind of attitude towards an ecology and a certain model towards the urban. When you read, I think, a lot of the language of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there is this kind of shared optimism, which I believe you guys actually have in this room today. There's a necessity, I guess, to try to foster that and continuously sort of remind yourselves why you came here. The words of Negroponte for me are just as valid today as they were in the 60s. The studio itself is a kind of context where we may privilege certain attitudes in terms of the invited critics that we bring, but generally the day-to-day is really about students teaching students, staff and students working together, working through the problems of making, using computation, digital analog forms of feedback, and sort of trying, with whatever limits and constraints that we have, which are plenty, to believe that these kinds of experiments will give us a new knowledge for development. The students build prototypes. We are trying to move beyond these kind of attitudes of illustration and representation. There are representational features in the things that we do, but we're trying to actually problematize the issue of making. Making and design, like I said, is this shift for us. And the idea of the prototypical is a certain attitude that we try to bring within the studio, which we believe is a very practice-based attitude. When you look at the history of the seminal figures within experimentation, I think they were just as open to understand the complexities of what their undertakings were. And maybe that's why they actually fostered some success. So someone like Otto developing these very complex ways of understanding how to erect a system. In the studio, we try to explore places like Hook Park, places where we are able to actually build larger sort of prototypes and making. So we arrange things. In this kind of photograph, you have a phase 2 group that's basically making an airborne architecture. And on the left-hand side, the first workshop, which we do, a material computation textile workshop. In the history of the DRL, we haven't had an amazing amount of opportunities to build things outside in the real world, but when we do, we treat that as a live experiment in itself. This was our celebration for our 10th anniversary. We held a competition for our graduates and students to participate in terms of developing a structurally developed response to a company who basically makes fiber-based concrete panels. It was a live experiment. Our students built it. The iterations, 40 of them that actually were there, were done with staff, students, consultants, and these are the students actually erecting it outside. It served as a way and a reminder for us to continuously try to foster new relationships with the everyday. Even something as simple as putting these things outside the steps of the AA open up a new audience in terms of people who are curious, ask questions, and in a way start to shape a kind of interesting dialogue. So if that pavilion cost valued somewhere £250,000, this one is something that we did with £200. It's not the same, I get it, but at the same time, these were done by students that are first 2-3 weeks within the course, actually developing things using the CNC machines. They're actually trying to explore how to work with these things, and I think this is a really important part of what we do. What we've been doing up till now that shapes our current agenda is something that we've been calling Protodesign. That was really a move towards looking at materiality and production processes and trying to understand that complexity and move that towards a certain architectural problem and building problem. What we've responded to as a certain consequence of a lot of that investigation that started with materiality was to try to reintroduce maybe some of the problems of the urban. If you look at some of the problems here, Thomas Edison was working 100 years ago on the problem of making a house in a day, a single pork. On the right is some of our flexible formwork research. If you look at the conversations today with people talking about fabrication as it's something unique to architecture today, you have people like Baruch Koshnevitz who's talking about printing a house in a day. The issue is not necessarily the tools and the techniques. We take it as a given that these are the tools, techniques, methodologies of today, and by that we assume that you're going to be using them if you can. The problem is that the house is still a challenge, and architecture makes certain demands, and so does urbanism, and so that's why we try to explore as much as possible how we can sort of participate in this conversation. We make a certain attitude towards computation as being a window into that possible future, and creating a certain kind of platform or a framework of communication that is multidisciplinary by its very nature. Doing that and talking about computation today is basically very, very meaningless as a statement. So one of the things that we do in the studio continuously is debate the different kinds of computational strategies one can sort of deploy. That may start with analog forms, that may start with parametric, with behavioral and generative approaches. The faculty members obviously also have very different positions on this, And every 2 weeks, we sort of debate that with the students, with the projects, as a way of really trying to foster a community within a community. This is pretty much our contemporary project. Looking at things like Google developing autonomous cars within the city.
Shit. Holy shit. There's no fucking hands on that wheel. Oh my god.
When we look at where technology is actually sort of embedding itself, it's embedding in everyday objects, it's embedding itself in all aspects of what we do. If the car is one aspect, and if we look at our vacuum cleaner on the other hand, there's a certain attitude towards designing intelligent systems that foster a certain relationship to the environment. For us, very particularly within this new agenda, the environment plays a very critical role. Working towards systems that are real-time, working towards a certain agenda that looks at time as something that's evolving and that has to have a self-awareness within that. So these are two different companies that design robotic self-cleaning systems that you deploy when you're not there, and they run around and they clean your house. This kind of mapping is an interesting thing. When you look at the history of machine learning, you can look in the 90s to people like Carl Sims, who was talking about developing a certain form of behavioral fitness, creatures that would evolve their own body plans and become a sort of genetic family of iterations. We're not designing necessarily the explicit thing in itself, we're designing the relationships in between. Those kind of robotics and those kind of ideas of evolution are also developing new systems for all kinds of issues. This is Boston Dynamics. It's a Boston, obviously, based company that's developing these kind of creatures for, let's call it more military purposes, but on the other hand, for search and rescue, for issues to deal with earthquake responses. He's sort of just jumping around, but he has developed a certain way, or she, whatever you want to call it, it responds to context. And so, for example, it's able to self-stabilize itself, it's able to deal with different terrains, it's also able to deal with different problems. So in a way, this kind of response could not be something that already privileges a certain relationship. Like, the dog doesn't know it's going to get kicked. The dog can only respond to the kick. And we start to sort of develop a certain kind of fitness criteria. When we look at algorithms in particular, we can start to use algorithms in a way to learn. So if the agenda is on the right, on the left, to mimic Mona Lisa by going through random sequences, we can develop kind of learning systems through computation that in some sense have a certain fitness criteria that it meets. If painting is basically something that's, let's say, more akin to what we know, that same algorithm can be used to play Super Mario Brothers and to win. So every time it sort of runs, it's able to understand its context, and in a certain way, algorithms don't have a default kind of relationship to its output. It's only in a certain sense where people in particularly have talked about parametrics as a very kind of generic sort of attitude towards things. We're trying to talk about it in a very different way. When we look at certain seminal projects that are used in every sort of textbook, we look at things like these detour networks by Fry Otto. Maybe one of the things that is very important to understand is that these networks are obviously time-based because they're wet wool and water. And over time, that's something that obviously changes. In the way that he was able to sort of mark that, we see it in this form. Within digital computation, we have the ability to have a slightly different relationship to time. We can accelerate it, we can let things run, we can deal with certain ideas that actually look at dynamic stability instead of thinking that there are finite sort of versions of how we relate to a lot of objects within the world. Material experiments form a lot of part of how we sort of explore a lot of these things, partly because we look at not necessarily just natural systems, but synthetic systems. We try to explore and understand how things operate and work, and the students try to understand that by running experiments over and over and over again. This isn't like a scientific laboratory. We don't pretend we're scientists. But we do have a very active and observing dependent way of working through some of the problems, and at the same time setting up certain computational frameworks for us to explore. When we look back to the city, and we look back at a series of visionary projects that were dealing with that, we usually render these projects utopian, been there, done that, that didn't happen. What we usually get is like, okay, if we were talking about ArchiZoom and SuperStudio, we get Houston, a car-dependent city. And I don't necessarily think that that conversation is very productive. There wasn't a problem about the creative nature. It was basically how to deal with change. Not all architectural problems are known within the urban environment. Some are latent, and obviously some are emerging. The way that we've been working on some of these problems is to look at different ways and models that actually deal with a certain relationship. Sometimes they're called bottom-up strategies, sometimes they're called generative design strategies. For example, stigmergic systems that are known in termites and other sort of pheromone-driven systems, how we can computationally use that and drive a certain attitude towards making and organization. So depositional strategies, which are primary and termite mound making, potentially could be a way to build these kind of systems in themselves. When we talk about robots and all of this other stuff, these things have a home in the studio. Kids try to do that. Kids try to augment CNC machines. We try to develop things as ways, as a response to really what we're doing. Some of those things are robotic. Some of those things can literally be as simple as dealing with certain kinds of forces like magnetic forces and ferrofluids, and just really starting to understand what it means when you're not dealing with form, but with formation. Formation as being something that's not necessarily stuck in time. We can recognize it with a certain stability, but actually these things are lifelike open processes. And our ability to work with that could start with something that's very simple, but it can emerge as a thesis, which for those that are in the DRL and for those who are interested, you can come and sit in with some of the projects. Sometimes we literally hack machines that we have here, like a simple CNC machine, to sort of play and try to understand what it means to control deposition, like I was talking about before. But we try to do that with also a different sensibility of material. So this material phase changes at the moment from dropping or release of the actual nozzle to split seconds before that. The students explore different things because time, for example, is something that's very open. We fostered relationships with people like Festo on the left that was developing more advanced depositional systems, but on the right, in the first couple of workshops, we can still deal with phase change and these kind of more complex problems. As a reminder, we have a whole series of let's call them legends within the field, people like Dieste, Candela, that try to talk to us about a different kind of relationship between form, structure, and practice. And though at some moment in time, in particular within Protodesign, we were focusing on this for this sake, trying to develop prototypical systems, I think one of the things that we are really going to try to explore is actually what that means in the everyday, particularly within the urban. So for Dieste, the gas station was a very noble project, just as much as a church or a factory. And I think our attitude towards the design of these things will actually shape itself relative to that. I have the pleasure of giving a talk next week, which I invite anybody who's not in the DRL who's interested to see some of those things on Friday. And I just want to sort of remind everybody that as we started this presentation, you are basically the continuing experiment and the next generation of a series of people here. There's a certain expectation that you're here with that kind of motivated purpose. We all start to then get into our respective camps, different graduate programs, different unit systems. I urge you to really sort of engage with each other, try to foster different problems and working relationships. We try to pack in as much as we can, all of the graduate directors, to give you guys a very fixed and clear agenda. But some of the problems that you guys are going to discover potentially could use the resources of other faculty members here. And I think being that this is a very open place, you should engage with the other students of the different programs and other staff as well, okay? So with that, I think I'm done, and welcome to the AA. Just to mention for the DRL students, at the end of all of this, we'll be distributing a course guide that'll tell you what we actually do with seminars, workshops, and all of that other stuff. Okay, thanks.